right. I open that. Yeah. Yes. Okay. All right. So this chapter, it's really hard for me to figure out like how to organize a lecture on it, because it's, to me, it's empirical. It's an empirical chapter that's illustrating his theory of relative surplus value and through machinery. But there's just so much rich, I would say, theoretical or analytical nuggets in there where he's actually making very significant, broad, I would even say abstract claims about how capitalism operates. And as we'll get into, it's very clear that Marx kind of thinks capitalism doesn't really get on its feet, if you will, until this transition to machinery. As we'll see, like, this is when capital is really able to fully subsume or fully dominate the worker in the labor process and fully control the labor process. And therefore, I think he like took this chapter as a little opportunity to kind of lay out all these other general things that this transition leads to that can be seen as general things that happen under the capitalist mode of production. So it's, to me, a really analytically rich, but also obviously empirically rich chapter. So I have a lot of slides. That's what I'm trying to say. But first, I think it starts off, and by the way, I'll be going through this monstrosity throughout the day, which is, 10 sections. Some sections have as many as 5 subsections, so it's a lot to get through. But the chapter starts with this quite, I think, pretty interesting opening, which is really sort of tackling, again, classical political economists like John Stuart Mill, who says it is questionable if all the mechanical inventions yet made have lightened the day's toil of any human being. So from the start, sort of bringing up this kind of relationship, like, what is this relationship between machinery and labor, and as we'll get into, automation and lightening labor and so forth. But he says right off the bat, that is, however, by no means the aim of the application of machinery under capitalism. Like every other instrument for increasing the productivity of labor, machinery is intended to cheapen commodities. And by shortening the part of the working day in which the worker works for himself, to lengthen the other part the party gives to the capitalist for nothing. The machine is a means of producing surplus value. So before we get into the kind of broader meaning of this, we should review a little bit that this is just a new method that he's introduced of producing surplus value, particularly relative surplus value. And we can include other methods like even what he calls simple cooperation. If you bring a bunch of workers under one roof and they are sort of working together, they're going to be more productive as a collective laborer. But then we get cooperation, but then he says, the more express sort of conscious subdivision of labor and the what's called the division of labor and manufacture is sort of a more streamlined sort of way of improving labor productivity through the kind of subdivision of labor. So I think buried in this chapter, he also brings up what he calls the intensification of labor, which is like, basically, regardless of how you divide the labor or get it to cooperate, you can just get the workers to work faster in a shorter period of time. And intensification, as we'll hear, is what often, like in the real world, workers call speed up, like this push to speed up your productivity, and the ways in which, obviously, when production is organized through machinery, the capital then can actually literally control the speed of production, if you think of classically like an assembly line and things like this. But anyway, we just want to sort of keep in mind that there's these other methods that we've reviewed, including lengthening the working day, which is absolute surplus value. But cooperation, division of labor, intensification of labor, those are all methods, but also substituting labor with machinery that's way more productive is another method, and that's what this whole chapter is about. And again, chapters 12 through 15, all of these methods are aimed at one thing, which is improving labor productivity, and that's kind of the standard definition of relative surplus value. So I think it brings up, though, these sort of broader questions about what is machinery technology for under a capitalist society. And a lot of what this chapter is about this little meme that I've been showing in my undergrad class for years, which is that, under capitalism, you find a robot takes over your job, does it way more efficiently, and you're like thrown, as Mark would say in the chapter, like flung into the labor market where you have suddenly no means of subsistence and you're desperate to find another job. Whereas under a different kind of social relations, we could have machinery and technology be harnessed for the goal, not of creating surplus value, but of like actually creating free time for everyone, right? And so that's, again, the kind of tension this chapter is trying to get us at, is why is it under capitalism we have all this automation, all this technology, yet we're more exhausted and more overworked and more miserable than ever, right? And not to mention that if we do lose our job because of this improvement in technology, it creates more misery, right? We are sort of now thrown into the labor market, desperate for more work. Okay, so given that footnote, again, I probably shouldn't say too much in case you want to write on this, but he compares Darwin's history of the history of nature, evolution, to a critical history of technology. And he says, does not hit a history of the productive organs of man and society, of organs that are the material basis of every particular organization of society, deserve equal attention to what Darwin focused on in terms of natural organization? And would not such a history be easier to compile, since, as Vico says, human history differs from natural history in that we have made the former but not the latter? So this is kind of the thing Harvey gets really excited about. Technology reveals the active relation of humans to nature, the direct process of the production of life, and thereby also lays bare the process of production of the social relations of life and the mental conceptions that flow from those relations. That's, for the Marx nerds in the room, that's like classic sort of base superstructure thinking. Like technology and production are kind of the base, and then ways of thinking, conscious ideas and ideologies and culture sort of come out of that material basis. But technology is really at that basis, right? That active relation of humans to nature. And I think this is great. Like if you want to do a history of ideas or ideology, like religion, even a history of religion that is written in abstraction from this material basis is uncritical. So he says he wants a critical history of technology. Well, this is an uncritical one. If you did a sort of history of religion that only looked at the ideas sort of in isolation from this material basis, right? It is in reality much easier to discover by analysis the earthly kernel of the misty creations of religion than to do the opposite, to develop from the actual given relations of life. This is where I love, Marx's historical materialism is really like an ecological theory about life and how is the materiality of life reproduced. The forms in which these have been apotheosized. The latter method is the only materialist and therefore the only scientific one. So there he is again saying my way of doing things is scientific and everyone else is dumb. The weaknesses of the abstract materialism of natural science, materialism which excludes the historical process, are immediately evident from the abstract and ideological conceptions expressed by its spokesmen whenever they venture beyond the bounds of their own specialty. So just doing material work doesn't mean you're also scientific, because you could do kind of material science and abstraction from history and human relations and politics and society and class relations and all the other stuff, right? And I think he would critique a lot of natural science at the time for not really being grounded in these larger political and social relations that if you're in like what is called social studies of science, it's a whole field, and like they would also agree, like we can't look at science apart from like social and political relationships. So that's a really rich sort of theoretical framework for the whole chapter, I'd say, of thinking through this machinery through the social relations of capitalism that are about capital exploiting labor to produce surplus value and how it produces a particular kind of technology. Okay. I'm wondering why this, whatever. There it goes. So, part one, section one. I think it's a really important section because this is kind of where he kind of gives you sort of definitions of what a machine is, particularly. We find that a machine has three different parts. The motor mechanism, he also talks about the source of motive power, the transmitting mechanism, and finally the tool or working machine. So classically, and we'll talk about it more, like a steam engine has a source of power, which is the steam that is ultimately generated from, eventually coal, boils water, creates steam. The steam goes into the steam pipe piston rod thing, and the steam is what, if you look at your tea kettle when it's going up, that kind of relationship of steam creating like force is at the core of basically modern industrial revolution. and that steam that is able to be harnessed by this mechanism then gets that power gets transferred into the transmitting mechanisms, right, which are, I guess, the cylinder and the shaft, which transfers the power over to the wheel, which does work on something, right? And the tool or the working machine is the thing that's now doing work on something. Incidentally, does anyone know why what the first application of the steam engine was used for? Well, as I'll get into in a second, Britain at the time was really, we haven't talked much about Malthus, but it was really sort of hitting up against some kind of Malthusian limits. It had basically started deforesting its territory for energy, right, for wood. And it used wood for heating, but also it used wood for all sorts of industrial processes like iron smelting and iron. So basically, if you had ironworks, they were all set up next to forests because you would use the wood for charcoal for fuel. And eventually they discovered that they could use coal, right, for heat energy instead of wood. And coal's underneath the ground, so it doesn't take as much land. But what happened was that the deeper they got at the coal, it would get flooded with water, right? And once the mine is flooded, it's really hard to get the coal out because there's water everywhere and it's not safe, and et cetera. So what they had to do is pump the water out of the mines to get at more coal. And they would, before, the only way they could pump it was with a human or even an animal power to sort of pump the water out. And the steam engine was used as a mechanical pump to pump the water out of the coal mines. So as we'll get into, like, basically the steam engine sort of becomes this fossil fuel powered machine system that was originally used to get at more fossil fuel underneath the ground. So it's kind of wild. But again, like, you think about the tool or the working machine is taking over and mechanically doing something that a human hand used to have to do, right? Or an animal hand. And I think they'd even like get buckets and try to get the water out that way. But the steam engine made it way more efficient to get that water out and therefore get at way more coal. So I think importantly, though, he says, the machine is therefore a mechanism that, after being set into motion, performs with its tools the same operation that the worker formerly did with similar tools. So that's really, it's that third aspect, the tool or working machine, that replaces what a manual worker used to do. And that's what makes a machine a machine. So he does say whether the motive power is derived from man or humans or in turn from a machine makes no difference here. So he actually would say that if we have this kind of machine, I got this from my old energy historian guy named Vaclav Smil. If the machine is turned by a human hand and the tool is replacing other work elsewhere that's done by a human hand, then it's still a machine, right? Even though the motive power is a human, right? But here you have, I don't even know what this is, but I think it's like steam hammers that are crushing maybe coal, but you see the human people are shoveling it into this area where it's being crushed by these steam hammers. But obviously, before you probably would have had to have human hammers doing that, right? So it's quite mechanizing something that used to be done by human hands. But what happens is, as the increase in the size of the machine and the number of its working tools call for a more massive mechanism to drive it, and this mechanism, in order to overcome its own inertia, requires a mightier moving power than that of humans, quite apart from the fact that humans are very imperfect instruments for producing uniform and continuous motion. So essentially, the machines start to get so big and powerful that they really want a more powerful motive power, that first part of the machine. And that's where a lot of, he sort of starts the chapter by saying people are kind of confused. They think what really defines machine is a non-human motive power, but it's really the replacement of human tools that then just sort of gets so big that it needs a non-human motive power in the first place. So what can be that non-human motive power? At his time, there were basically, you can use water, which can be this powerful force that can turn a wheel and drive machinery, right? A lot of factories at the time used water power, right? But as he says, the page before, if you're paying attention, I should include, I don't know why I didn't include it, but 498, I'm just going to read it because it's there. He lays out why water power is kind of a problem, just from a physical standpoint. He says, the use of water power as the main motive force brought with it various difficulties. The flow of water cannot be increased at will. So it's kind of like you get the flow of water. It failed at certain seasons. You can have a drought where rivers dry up. And above all, it's essentially local, right? You can only set up a factory where there's falling water. And that means if you hang out, as I think people were talking about, hanging around the Adirondacks in the fall foliage and going to New England, you come across these old rural mill towns, right? Well, they were all mill towns that were set up on rivers, but they're scattered about in the countryside, right? Because the power is scattered about in rivers and water systems, right? So it's quite different. So there we get, not until the invention of Watt's second and so-called double-acting steam engine was a prime mover found, which drew its own motive power from the consumption of coal and water, was entirely under humans' control, was mobile, right? You can move it around, and a means of locomotion, was urban, and not like the water wheel, rural, permitted production to be concentrated in towns, and instead of like water wheels being scattered across the countryside. And finally, was of universal technical application and little affected by its choice of residence by local circumstances. So essentially with coal and steam, you get flexibility of, you can put it anywhere, you can locate it in cities and so forth. And clearly here we're talking about a source of power that's kind of superseding human power, right? And this is what's really important. As soon as tools have been converted from being manual implements of humans into the part of a mechanical apparatus of a machine, the motive mechanism has also acquired an independent form entirely emancipated from the restraints of human strength. So we're talking about a world historical shift where suddenly work can get done, not dependent on not just human strength, I would add animal strength, right? And so this is another Vaclav Smil chart that I've used over and over again in my life as an energy history person, which is that this is one way of just thinking about energy and how people get work done in society and where they draw the energy from. And as you can see, basically for most of human history, all work is being accomplished by human and animal muscle power. And, you know, those muscles might be driving machines in some way, but ultimately, most of it, it's like doing that, like actually doing that kind of work, like shoveling and moving stuff by hand, and animals moving stuff over land via transport. Like, as you can see, like they were able to harness a bit from water wheels and windmills at the time. And you can think of sailing as a form of wind-powered transportation that was pretty big at the time. We just had I can't believe we haven't canceled this holiday, but Columbus Day, celebrating this sailing guy, right? He was a sailor. He used wind power to transport across the oceans. But most work really had to be done by muscle power, right? And then this is what Marx is writing during this crazy revolution, where suddenly over the course of about 100 years, suddenly now all the motive power is being driven by machinery and not muscles, right? So this is where we get into Marxism has started to become quite interested in this transition to being quite significant for our current concerns with climate change. And if you've never heard of this book, it's really good. It's basically goes back to this industrial transition and tries to understand basically why capital really preferred steam power over water power, right? And it's kind of funny because if I recall, he doesn't just use that Marx quote where Marx kind of lays out some practical reasons why capital would choose. He kind of makes the case that actually water was really cheap, abundant, and easy to use. The problem was capitalists could not share the water power because it required it's what he called a flow resource. So it's like a commons that they had to kind of collectively set up infrastructures and pay for collectively. And they tried to set up these waterworks together as capitalists, and they couldn't agree who's going to pay for it, right? So they just abandoned it. But a steam engine is something that any individual private capitalist can control as their own capital, and they can, not have to worry about coordinating with society for their source of energy like you would with water power, right? So the private property relations of capitalism made steam much more preferable than water, which would require a kind of collective, and you might even say a communist kind of planning apparatus to kind of collectively share that power. The other crucial thing, which Marx says in about a sentence there, is that steam power allowed capital to locate in cities where there's abundant surpluses of labor for which they can exploit. And they don't have to be stuck out in the countryside where there's not a lot of workers, right? And if they want to hire workers, the workers have all the leverage because there's not many of them. And in fact, Malm shows that early water-powered factories would basically just try to impose slavery because they couldn't figure out how to control workers otherwise, because they're kind of captured by the lack of available labor. So steam power is great because you can locate it in the city where labor is plentiful. There's just a surplus of labor, and therefore steam was much more conducive to this particular social relations of capital and wage labor. I hate to do self-aggrandizement, but I also tried to make an argument many years ago. What was this? 14 years ago, about why fossil fuels are like I called it historically specific and necessary to the capitalist mode of production. It's a geography journal, so I brought in space. But the argument I made was more that I think Malm's argument's better, so credit to him. But my argument was that basically this transition from muscle power to machine power was one in which what Marx considers the crucial relationship of capital, wage labor, was a more sort of adequate social relationship to a machine powered system. Whereas you can imagine that when all work is done by muscle power, different feudal or even slave modes of production make a lot of sense because you've coercively controlled the main productive force of production, right? The bodies, the muscles, right? But under machine production, the productive forces are no longer muscles, but they're these machines, these means of production that capital then controls. And once the main productive forces are machines powered by fossil fuels, then suddenly the labor part, the muscles part, are not something you want to coercively control, but something you want to be able to hire and fire and sort of flexibly use in and out of the production process. So I use this quote from where is it's deep into this chapter 617, where he says, thus the large-scale industry by its very nature necessitates variation of labor, fluidity of functions, mobility of the worker in all directions. And it's that capital and machine production, wage labor is really great for that kind of flexibility and variability of labor, because you're always, you only want to produce when there's demand. You want to be able to, when there's a crisis, you want to just be able to fire all your workers all at once, right? Or if there's a big boom, you want to be able to hire a bunch of workers all at once. So wage labor became really a perfect sort of social relation to complement this kind of machine kind of production, in contrast to previous historical modes of production. So that was my argument. But ultimately, these are trying to grapple with that we live in a world that the core productive forces of society are now wrapped up in fossil fuels. And unfortunately, when I wrote this, about 80% of global energy is powered by fossil fuels, and still today about 80% of global energy is powered by fossil fuels. So we really, I think Marxists are sort of getting better at theorizing these relationships between capitalism and fossil fuels, but we haven't gotten that great at actually getting capitalism off of fossil fuels. So that's something we need to work on. Okay. So what we're ultimately talking about is, by the way, societies had used fossil fuels for centuries before this. The Chinese used it a lot for heat energy, for various industrial heat applications. But what really makes the Industrial Revolution is not just fossil fuels, but fossil fuel powered automatic machinery, right? And that's where you start to get these machines constitute itself as a vast automaton, right? These machines are then automatically doing work that had to be previously done by human hands. And that it's really automation that constitutes the Industrial Revolution. It's not just simply the use of energy or something like that. And later on page 503, he just refers to it, we have an automatic system of machinery. And I think it's that automatic part that really matters. And, we're still going through this. People now want to automate me as a teacher, right? There's basically journalism now is going to be automated through artificial intelligence, right? But this has a long history. I often give the example that when automobiles first came around, they were called horseless carriages because people didn't have a concept of a mobile wheel system that moves through the territory that isn't driven by animal power. That this idea of a carriage that moves automatically was just wild, right? So, okay. And once these machines start to get bigger and more elaborate and they sort of constitute the entire factory, it becomes this kind of thing outside the workers, right? This demonic power that burst forth in fast and feverish whirl of its countless working organs. I think the other metaphor he uses a lot is Cyclops, like this idea of this sort of like automated machine that sort of is standing over the workers and sort of this demonic cyclopean force. The other thing that happens is capital revolutionizes. And again, if we go back to the chapter 12, he's talking about like relative surplus value is about revolutionizing the mode of production, right? And that's, so when you revolutionize the mode of production, you suddenly can produce so much more with machinery you also have to revolutionize what he calls the means of communication and the means of transport. So if you're going to be producing all these textiles in Britain, suddenly your local market's going to be exhausted really quickly. So you need to figure out how to ship that stuff much faster all around the world and communicate prices about it all around the world, right? So revolution in the general conditions of social production, the means of communication and transport. So the steam engine, first used to get coal out of mines. Sooner or later, they start hooking them up to factories that are driving production of textiles. But sooner or later, they figure out how to set up these steam engines on locomotives, railways, or steam ships, right? Because again, before this, all shipping was wind dependent or river dependent, right? So a lot of shipping, the cheapest thing is to put it on a river and it floats down the river, right? The current carries. But you know, if you want to ship stuff upriver, now you got a steam engine that can just shoot right through that current upriver, right? And it can go way faster, right? So it's way more, as he says in the Grundrisse, these technologies annihilate space with time, right? I think I might have mentioned that before. You know, they by this technology sort of allows people to go across vast quantities of space in shorter periods of time. And you also, this is the period where they developed the telegraph, right? And in my article on fossil fuels, I talk about how these kind of, I call them revolutions in circulation, allow there to, for the first time in human history, there start to develop like global markets in, the price of wheat starts to be shaped by conditions in North Dakota and Australia and Russia. Like there starts to be global wheat markets where they're trading global grain on these markets, and they're communicating the price of wheat in these global markets through the telegraph, right? And you're starting to stitch together a kind of global commodity market. So again, throughout this chapter, he's really trying to contrast how different machine production is with the system he called in previous chapter 14, manufacture, right? Which is based on the division of labor and the human, where human organs are the main productive force, right? In manufacture, the organization of social labor process is purely subjective, and by that he means it's driven by human subjectivity and people. It is a combination of specialized workers. Large-scale industry, on the other hand, possesses in the machine system an entirely objective organization of production, which confronts the worker as a pre-existing material condition of production. In simple cooperation, even the most specialized form based on the division of labor, the extrusion of the isolated worker by the associated worker still appears to be more or less accidental. Machinery, with few exceptions to be mentioned later, operates only by means of associated labor or labor in common. And so remember last time, like he's talking about how the labor process is becoming increasingly socialized. Well, machine production does that even further. Hence, the cooperative character of the labor process in this case is in this case a technical necessity dictated by the very nature of the instrument of labor. Now, I get into in a second, yeah, that a lot of why he considers this more social labor has to do with the fact that it relies a lot more on science, right? And scientific knowledge, which is ultimately social. But before we get to that, I wanted to reflect on, again, what does he mean by socialization of production, social labor? This little footnote from 616, where he talks about in some parts of Highlands of Scotland, not so many years ago, every peasant, according to the statistical account, made their own shoes, leather, tanned by themselves. Many a shepherd and cotter too, with their wife and children, appeared in church in clothes which had been touched by no hands but their own, since they were shorn from sheep and sewn from the flax field. In the preparation of these, it's added scarcely a single article had been purchased, except that all needle, thimble, and very few parts of the ironwork employed by weaving. The dyes, too, were chiefly extracted by the women from trees, shrubs, and herbs. So this is not social production, where private peasant individuals or artisans produce everything they need as little families, right? Little sort of scattered private producers, and they kind of have this self-sufficiency, and it's not, they can do it on themselves. They're not coordinating in a social production system where they are like we are today. Like everything we consume is a product of millions of different workers that make that stuff come to our plate or our closet or our desk. All these commodities are products of socialized labor, all these connections of labor. So for Marx, machinery really further socializes that, and that is because of science, which helps us transition into section 2 of 10, where he starts to talk about how machinery transfers value to the product. But the paragraph right before really sort of highlights how he thinks science is so important to this. The instrument of labor assumes a material mode of existence which necessitates the replacement of human force by natural forces and the replacement of the rule of thumb by the conscious application of natural science. In manufacture, the organization of the social labor process purely subjective. Wait, was that the one I already read? Yeah, so that is where science comes into the play. But what's interesting is that if you remember, when he gets to part 2, he says, we saw that the productive forces resulting from cooperation and division of labor cost capital nothing. So if you remember last time, he's paying all the workers as individuals, but collectively they produce more value as a collective, and they just get to appropriate that value for free. Well, he's saying the same thing as these natural forces that are provided by science. Basically, steam, water, they cost nothing. So again, these capitalists who have these steam engines, they don't really necessarily pay for all the science, like all the years of scientific grueling process to kind of discover these applications, discover how to make steam generate force in these little engines, like all that science. What in the Grundrisse, he calls it the general intellect of like how knowledge and science and human progress gets sort of collectively produced, and then capital gets to kind of privately appropriate that science for their own profit making, right? And so that's again what I think he means by socialization of production. Now capital is starting to sort of parasitically draw from the socialization of knowledge and science production and to transfer into machinery. Okay. So section 2 is a lot about value, and the big thing we should note is this mode of production way more productive, right? And he has a lot of examples. Before Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, the separation of the seed from the pound of cotton cost an average day's labor, but by means of the invention became possible for this one Black woman to clean 100 pounds a day, right? So a pound a day to 100 pounds a day, right? So that's the difference machinery makes. We're talking about orders of magnitude. And that really affects the price or the value of these things, right? So a raw cotton, which costs 50 cents to produce, now is 10 cents, right? And he says steam plow does as much as work in an hour at the cost of whatever D is. I still don't know what D is. 66 men cost of 15. So you're talking about like one steam plow equals 66 people, right? So again, machinery is like a whole nother level of productivity that again supersedes the limits of human muscles or animal muscles or anything like this. And this is actually way deeper in the chapter where he talks about how according to the system of division of labor and manufacture was productive, but machinery just blows it out of the water, right? So according to Adam Smith, 10 men in his time using the system of division of labor made 48,000 sewing needles every day. And this is what Adam Smith celebrated as this incredible efficiency, right? But a single needle making machine, however, makes 145,000 needles in a working day of 11 hours. One woman or girl superintends for 4 machines and so produces 600,000 needles in a day, or 3 million a week. So again, all these examples show just how much more they can produce in the same amount of time. So that's the definition of labor productivity go up, right? This is, you can only do so much by making the labor more efficient by subdividing it. These machines just raise labor productivity like a whole nother level. And that obviously cheapens each. So if you can produce, you know, instead of 48,000 a day, 600,000 a day, that means each one you produce is going to be cheaper because it's, you know, absorbing that much less labor, that much more fixed capital and materials and so forth. So this is about, as the whole section is about, it's about cheapening commodities through increasing labor productivity. So he then goes, it is evident whatever it costs as much labor to. So this is where he starts to talk about like the value of machine invested versus the value you save of workers replaced. And he says, whenever it costs as much labor to produce a machine as is saved by the employment of machine, all that has taken place is the displacement of labor. So they kind of could equal each other out in that scenario. And in that case, the total labor required to produce the commodity has not been lessened, and therefore no productivity increase has happened. So, you know, you have to think about how much labor did it take to produce the machine before you think about whether or not you would want to employ that. And he goes that there's further limits to this. The use of machinery for exclusive purpose of cheapening the product is limited by the requirement that less labor must be expended in producing the machinery than is displaced by the employment of that machinery. For the capitals, however, there's a further limit on use. Instead of paying for the labor, he pays only the value of the labor power employed. The limit to his using machine is therefore fixed by the difference between the value of the machine and the value of the labor power replaced by it. He gets into the fact that you only pay for, say, half the day's labor, and the labor can produce more. So you have to take into account that extra surplus labor that the workers can provide when you're calculating whether or not it makes sense to replace them with a machine. And what he gets at in this section is that under capitalism, it can make a lot of sense to keep, if labor is really cheap, it doesn't make sense to invest in machinery. So there are parts of the world today still where labor is so cheap that why mechanize? Why replace that labor with machinery when you can just hire cheap labor? And he uses the example, in England, women are still used instead of horses for hauling barges, okay? Because the labor required to produce horses and machines is an accurately known quantity, while the required to maintain the women of surplus population is beneath all calculation. Hence, we nowhere found a more shameless squandering of human labor for despicable purposes than in England, the land of machinery. And he's constantly doing this, like the land of progress. All this technical innovation is like also the land of the most horrific just exploitation and squandering of human material that you could ever imagine. And again, the premise of this analysis is that you have a situation where workers there's so many surplus laborers out there that there's sort of an oversupply. They're so cheap that you wouldn't need a machine to replace them because you'd rather pay for the cheap labor. Okay. Section 3, right? Hopefully. Okay, so then he gets into the effects on the workers. The biggest effect is when you replace human strength with machines, you can then hire out cheaper labor, which can be of less muscular strength, which are women and children, right? So he argues that it's really machinery that allows capital to go against the resistance of so-called male workers who drove the division of labor. Remember, he says at the end of chapter 14 that capital is always sort of bound to be struggling against these insubordinate workers during the system of division of labor. You can break those workers' resistance by replacing them with machines and then hiring basically cheaper labor, women and children, to just mine the machines, because suddenly your labor doesn't need to be so strong, right? So as you can see, part A, the employment of women and children. Part B, you know, he tells us we're going to keep the working day fixed in part 4, but he says actually what happens is you invest these machines and then they have a further desire to expand the working day. Why? Because now they've invested all this capital in these machines and they got to keep the machines running 24/7, and they have all this debt now, which he doesn't talk a lot about, but this is my analysis, that capital's so freaked out about all the debt they've racked up in these machines that they feel like we've got to work this thing to the bone, work these workers to the bone. So they actually try to increase the working day as much as possible. So in that section, he also talks about what he calls an imminent contradiction, which I think is sort of actually becomes pretty interesting down the line in Capital, even in volume 3, where he says, in the application of machinery to the production of surplus value, since of the two factors of the surplus value created by a given amount of capital, one, the rate of surplus value cannot be increased except by diminishing the other, the number of workers. Ultimately, if we believe Marx thinks that all surplus value comes from living labor, this one method of getting surplus value, it comes by diminishing the amount of living workers in the productive process. So you see this little problem, right? You're actually automating away the living source of surplus value in the first place. And what's interesting is that when you do these kind of innovations that raise labor productivity, you just get these surplus profits. Do you remember where he's like, the capitalist just gets this kind of surplus profit, but then all the other capitalists catch up, and then it cheapens the commodities. Now everyone's back to square one, and they have less workers now, so they can't generate as much surplus value, right? So that's an imminent contradiction. And then he goes on to talk about what he calls a major paradox, which he goes, on the other hand, partly by placing the capitalist's disposal new strata of the working class previously inaccessible to him, partly by setting free the workers that supplants machinery, produces a surplus working population, which is a kind of spoiler alert. He's going to really flesh out this concept of surplus populations later. But here he's saying that machinery kind of sets free all these workers and throws them into this surplus working population. Once you're thrown into that surplus, you're compelled to submit to the dictates of capital. You're like desperate. Capital, please hire me. I'm desperate. I've been fired. Hence the remarkable phenomenon in the history of modern industry that machinery sweeps away every moral and natural restriction on the length of the working day. Hence, too, the economic paradox that the most powerful instrument for reducing labor time suffers a dialectical, would be one of the few mentions of dialectical in the whole book, dialectical inversion, and becomes the most unfailing means for turning the whole lifetime of the worker and his family into the labor time at capital's disposal for his own valorization. So again, throughout this whole chapter, it's these big paradoxes, like this thing that's supposed to be about progress and freeing humanity is like actually enslaving humanity even worse because it's controlled by capitalists. Right? Part C gets into that thing I talked about earlier, the intensification of labor. So once this is where he says, okay, they do pass these laws that limit the working day. And once those laws are in place, capital has to figure out how to get as much out of those workers with these machines as possible. And he talks about filling up the pores of the working day. There's actually an incredible story where, you know, if you don't know much about the history of the auto industry, but in the 70s and 80s, everyone was going wild about how Japanese, they called it Toyotaism, or Toyota production had just become way more efficient than kind of American Fordist style production. And basically what they figured out is they were able to get out of every minute, you know, the American worker was working 45 seconds, but the Japanese were able to get them to work 54 seconds. And it was like saving those like 9 seconds of the minute that really revolutionized the whole production process. So filling up the pores. And ultimately part C is about, again, what I called earlier, speed up, figuring out how to speed up production, get workers to work faster. And again, if the productive forces of the labor process itself are machines, you can speed up the machines themselves. If you've ever seen the movie Modern Times with Charlie Chaplin, you know, it's sort of this comical thing where he's in the factory and the boss up top is like actually changing the speed of the assembly line and getting Charlie Chaplin to work faster. And his whole body gets kind of like subsumed in the machine itself. It's really intense. Okay. Wait a sec. Okay, so then we get into part 4, the factory. And here I think he's really starting to get into how under machine production, capital has total domination of the workers on this process. They control the speed, they control the labor process. It's very different than the system of manufacture where it's ultimately controlled by these workers who drive it, right? Next reading, keep an eye out where he talks about this transition from what he calls formal subsumption of labor to capital to real subsumption, because the real subsumption is when capital suddenly gets the machinery, right? And then they get to control the nature of the labor process as opposed to this division of labor under manufacture. And, you know, that control and domination is not fun. In the handicrafts and manufacture, the worker makes use of the tool. In the factory, the machine makes use of the worker. Factory work exhausts the nervous system to the uttermost. At the same time, it does away with the many-sided play of the muscles and confiscates every atom of freedom. Again, watch that. I should just show the Charlie Chaplin. Both in bodily and intellectual activity, even lightening of labor becomes an instrument of torture. There's this language throughout the whole chapter. It's really intense. Owing to its conversion into an automaton, the instrument of labor confronts the worker during the labor process in the shape of capital, dead labor. And again, dead labor is labor of past workers. So the machinery is dead labor, right? It's the product of previous human labor, but it confronts the worker as this kind of frozen labor that it took to produce that machine. Dead labor, which dominates and soaks up living labor power. The separation of the intellectual faculties of the production process from manual labor. So separating mental and manual labor, which we've talked a lot about already. And the transformation of those faculties into powers exercised by capital over labor. Is finally completed by large-scale industry. So again, this is pretty big for Marx. This is a big shift. Then we get into real cool class struggle stuff, which is that, you know, these machines are hurting the workers, both the employed workers and the workers that are thrown out of work. So therefore there becomes a sort of struggle over these machines and a struggle between workers and capitalists over these machines. And he reviews the Luddites who, you know, these are this group of people who would smash machines, right? Because they put them out of work, right? And now Luddites, we'd say anti-technology, right? So these people got sort of constructed as sort of enemies of progress, right? They're trying to break the machines, but they were revolting against a society in which their skills and their labor was just deemed superfluous and totally not wanted by that society, and they're just thrown out into the street. So what did they do? Instead of rising up against the capitalists, they rise up against, or you could even say rage against the machine. And they go and try to fight the machine instead of the capitalist, right? Did I get lost here? So then, but ultimately, where am I? Can't see the page number, damn it. 557. Yeah, so, and essentially, you know, you get this, I mean, still today, people are, I mentioned earlier, I'm terrified these AI, they're going to make all our jobs go away and they're going to be thrown out into the street, right? The worker becomes a competitor with the machine. And when machinery seizes on an industry, it produces chronic misery around the workers who compete it with. So the ways in which machinery just creates misery is really crucial. Where the transition is rapid, the effect is acute and felt by great masses of people. World history offers no spectacle more frightful than the gradual extinction of the English handloom weavers. You have this sort of like artisanal craft handloom weavers who have developed, you know, centuries of tradition. This tragedy dragged on for decades, finally come to an end in 1838. Many of the weavers died of starvation. Many vegetated with their families for a long period on 2.5 D a day. And then remember I told you how the cheap textiles from Britain kind of deindustrialized India? He mentions that here. In India, the English cotton machinery produced an acute effect. The Governor General reported as follows in 1834-5, the misery hardly finds a parallel in the history of commerce. The bones of the cotton weavers are bleaching the plains of India. Pretty dark stuff. Then he gets into how this basically, how ultimately capital uses machinery as a weapon in class struggle whenever workers start to agitate or organize for their own interest. According to Gaskill, the steam engine was from the very first an antagonist of human power, an antagonist that enabled the capitalists to tread underfoot the growing demands of the workers, which threatened to drive the infant factory system into crisis. And this is one of the best lines of the whole book. And it would be possible to write a whole history of the inventions made since 1830 for the sole purpose of providing capital with weapons against the working class revolt. So again, if workers start organizing, you just say, well, we'll replace you with a machine, right? We'll figure out a way to make your work no longer necessary. In my first book, I talked about these, it's about oil, and I talked about how in the refinery industry, the workers started to get really upset by the pace of work, and they started organizing and striking in the late 50s, and the capitalists figured out that they could automate a lot of those workers' jobs through emergent information technology and computers. And so they realized when the workers went on strike, they could keep the refinery running without them, and then they just fired them all. It's like really, really dark, right? Okay. Part 6, the compensation theory. This is sort of, again, he's sort of pillaring these political economists who sort of apologize for like, oh, yes, machinery makes some people unemployed, but it generates new jobs and you still hear this constantly today. And I think really, rather than, he's basically trying to just say that even if that were the case, what it does is create this acute misery by the people that are unemployed. It creates all these sort of gyrations in other sectors of the economy that we need to take into account. So he says, so the real facts, which are travestied by the optimism of the economist, are these. Here's where he's like, here's the real facts, people. The workers, when driven out of the workshop by machinery, are thrown into the labor market. Their presence in the labor market increases the number of labor powers which are at disposable capitalist exploitation. In part 7, we shall see that this effect of machinery, which has been represented as compensation for the working class, is on the contrary a most frightful scourge. For present, I will only say that the workers have been thrown out of work in a given branch can no doubt look for employment in another branch if they find it, and thus renew the bond between them and the means of subsistence. This takes place only through the agency of new, additional capital, which is seeking investment, and in no way through the agency of the capital that was already functioning. So it's almost an accident if workers find a new job, right? And it really, to just say like, oh, it all evens out in the end, it's just like doing violence to these people whose lives are destroyed, right? And anyone who's grown up in this region, Rust Belt, knows that like, like when automation throws people out of work, it like has real living consequences. So he goes on. I'm gonna try to speed it up here. Talk about speed up, jeez. And then he talks about how machinery, like, it saves so much labor in like agriculture and basic material production that it frees up labor to produce a lot of luxuries. He talks about how it creates all these sectors of luxury production because there's just more material space to produce more stuff because you've produced the material basis. And he has this really interesting thing where he says, well, machinery has been so productive that it's freed up so much labor to become domestic slaves, to be basically like domestic servants in people's homes, right, for the rich, right? So people that cook and clean and take care of children and so forth. And he says, what an elevating consequence of the capitalist exploitation of machinery. And it's really interesting to think about how even in this era of the so-called industrial revolution, where all Marx wants to talk about are these factories and the industrial proletariat, that the so-called service economy or the so-called servant class is a much bigger proportion of the workforce. And he's trying to say that actually it's machinery and automation and industrial productivity that sort of frees up society to be able to put more money and capital into other stuff. And under capitalism, that other stuff means rich people have disposable income to hire servants. Although he does refer to them as slaves, so domestic slaves, whether or not they're wage slaves or not is not clear. In the United States, prior to this, there were literal domestic slaves. So anyway, then we get into 7, the repulsion and attraction. Again, how this machinery kind of throws workers in and out of the labor process according to market demands. And this is, again, just rich stuff about how this machine production system is sort of hardwired to produce crisis of overproduction and glut and crisis prices, collapsing of certain things. But first, he, again, like, he just throws in there in a little paragraph that what machine production also does is this. By ruining handicraft production of finished articles, machinery forcibly converts them into the fields for production of its raw material. Thus, India was compelled to produce raw materials, cotton, wool, hemp, jute, and indigo for Great Britain. By constantly turning workers into surplus, large-scale industry in all countries where it has taken root spurs a rapid increase in immigration. So the workers are thrown out of work and by this efficiency, if you will, and now they just have to migrate because there's no they've lost their livelihood and so forth. And immigration and the colonization of foreign lands. So this is the age of mass immigration, settler colonialism in Australia and the United States, and all this kind of stuff. People being thrown out of the normal way of working and thrown into the labor market, and they basically migrate out. And then this is, again, like he could write a whole book on this thing. A new and international division of labor springs up, one suited to the requirements of the main industrial countries, and converts one part of the globe into a chiefly agricultural field of production for supplying the other part, which remains preeminently industrial field. This revolution is linked with the far-reaching changes in agriculture, which we need not discuss any further at this point. But here he's starting to talk about emergent, what some scholars have called a world system of capitalism, where you have what they call the world system theorists like Emanuel Wallerstein, and they talk about the core countries that have all the industrial technology become the sort of exploiters of the peripheral countries that become raw material suppliers for this kind of industrial machine that now needs cotton, way more cotton, needs way more wool, hemp, jute, all these raw materials. Think about how the Congo became this reservoir of rubber during the late 19th century, and it was to furnish bicycle production and the industrial core and eventually automobile production, right? So again, this chapter is just throwing this out there. And by the way, this creates this new kind of world market situation where industrial machine production is at the core, and it sort of extends its tentacles out into the world and exploits much of the world. And so the factory system's tremendous capacity for expanding with sudden immense leaps and dependence on the world market necessarily gives rise to this cycle. Feverish production, a glut on the market, contraction of the market, which causes production to be crippled. The life of industry becomes a series of periods of moderate activity, prosperity, overproduction, crisis, and stagnation. And here we get a really funny passage where he just goes through history and shows how you get these little booms and then you get a panic and a crisis. And in decade after decade, there's just crisis after crisis, right? And I'm not going to read all this because it's gets pretty, it's rich. 1840, Great Depression, riots, the military called out to intervene, frightful suffering, it's just like crazy, stuff going on. And I think what's really interesting, he says, when you get full-on industrialization after 1815, during its 48 years, only 20 of the years were really prosperous, right? 28 of the years were just crisis, right? And so he's really showing that this system is just prone to instability and crisis. Not in this section, but later he talks about, which has become a pretty key phrase in Marx and Engels' thought, which is the anarchy of production. Like you get the sense that the system is just sort of out of control, booming and busting, uncontrollable, and prone towards catastrophic crisis all the time, right? Okay. Section 8. So this is a long section. Ultimately, I think this section is just trying to show that when you get machinery, the most horrific effects are on the people employed in these previous modes of production, like the domestic industry, which is people that work in their cottages or in their homes, or in the manufacturing system in these little workshops, or the handicrafts or whatever. And so the worst effects are felt by these folks. So you, so in this, it matters. Like the exploitation of cheap and immature labor power is carried out in a more shameless manner in modern manufacture than in the factory property. This is because the technical foundation of the factory system, namely the substitution of machines for muscular power and the light character of the labor, is almost entirely absent in manufacture. So in manufacture, where they're trying now to compete with machines, the only option they have is to push their living workers harder and harder, right? Economical use of the means of production, first systematically carried out in the factory system and coinciding there from the beginning, the most reckless squandering of labor power and the theft of normal requirements for the labor's function now in a given branch of industry turns uppermost into its antagonist and murderous side. Really strong language. He's talking about a murderous process of production. And the less the social productivity of labor and technical basis for the combination of labor processes are developed in that branch, the more does the murderous side of the economy emerge. So in the domestic industries, the manufacturer, the less developed they are, the more murderous this transition will be on them. Finally, section 9, which to me is the one where, and it's 3:30. To me, this is where he's really laying out this story of how machinery does create all this horror, but it also creates these conditions that can be harnessed for a better, dare I say, communist society. So, but he says, and this is quite eloquent, factory legislation, the first conscious and methodical reaction of society against the spontaneously developed form of its production process, just as much the necessary product of large-scale industry as cotton, yarn, self-actors, and the electric telegraph. So he's saying that these laws that come up to sort of react against the horrors are just as much a product as the products themselves. They're sort of a necessary consequence. And these laws do create different social conditions that can be harnessed for different things. And that's kind of what this section really gets at from my perspective. So he says that what is true of the division of labor within the workshop under the system of manufacture is also true in the division of labor within society. As long as handicrafts and manufacture form the universal basis of social production, the subjection of the producer to a single branch, breaking up of originally multifarious parts of employment, is a necessary aspect of the process of development. It is on that basis that each separate branch of production acquires its technically appropriate shape empirically and slowly perfects it. So again, it's a violent process, but he's saying it's a necessary process of developing this increasingly social form of production. And another interesting thing is that machine production and division of labor more broadly forces on the working class this kind of flexibility where they have to, as we now say, you have to work 3 or 4 or 5 jobs over your course of your lifetime. You always have to be varying in your job. By means of machinery, chemical process, it's continually transforming not only the technical basis of production, but also the functions of the worker and the social combinations of the labor process. It revolutionizes division of labor within society and incessantly throws masses of capital and workers in one branch to another. The variation of labor imposes itself after the manner of an overpowering natural law, And with blindly destructive action of a natural law that meets with obstacles everywhere, large-scale industry, through its very catastrophe, makes the recognition of variation of labor and the hints of the fitness of the worker for the maximum number of different kinds of labor into a question of life and death. People who get thrown out of work realize that to survive, they have to develop a new skill, a new mode of labor. This possibility of varying labor must become a general law of social production, and the existing relations must be adapted to permit its realization in practice. That monstrosity, I gotta read the rest of this disposable working population held in reserve and misery for the changing requirements of capitalist exploitation, must be replaced by the individual human who is absolutely available for different kinds of labor required of them. The partially developed individual who is merely the bearer of one specialized social function must be replaced by the totally developed individual for whom those different social functions are different modes of activity, each in turn. If you weren't aware, Marx said that communism would be, you do one thing in the morning, you hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, and philosophize at night or whatever. And I think what he's trying to say here is that capital, by developing this sort of flexibility of labor so that they can do all different sorts of things, it does sort of create the conditions in which workers can develop themselves as fully developed individuals under communism. And then, he talks about how the Factory Act does create compulsory education. The first meager concession wrung from capital is limited to combining elementary education with work in the factory. And he talks about how they set up little schools in the factories that are pretty much fraudulent. There can be no doubt that with the inevitable, that's big strength, like very strong language, the inevitable conquest of political power by the working class, technological education, both theoretical and practical, will take its proper place in the schools of the workers. So in this factory law, there becomes a little germ of an idea that actually education should be something universal for the whole working class that's generalized for everyone. And he says, there is also no doubt that those revolutionary ferments whose goal is the abolition of the division of labor stands in diametrical contradiction with the capitalist form of production and the economic situation of the workers, which corresponds to that form. However, the development of the contradictions of a given historical form of production is the only historical way in which it can be dissolved and then reconstructed on a new basis. So again, he's saying that only a new form of society is going to develop out of the contradictions of the current society. And that's classic Marx historical materialism there, that liberation, emancipation will come out of this capitalist mode of production. Did I skip one? Oh, man. There's one more line on page, I believe, 618 that's really crucial that I somehow didn't put in the PowerPoint. Where is it? 617. And this is, again, modern industry never views or treats the existing form of production process as the definitive one. Its technical basis is therefore revolutionary, whereas all earlier modes of production were essentially conservative. So again, he's really saying that this machine production is revolutionary, revolutionizes the capacities of production, creates certain conditions that then could be harnessed by the working class, even though in itself under capital is totally dehumanizing, totally exploitative, and totally destructive, but it could be otherwise, right? He also says that, we think it's horrible what this system does to the family, right? It, as you read in the section about women and children, it tears mothers away from the children. Children are just left to themselves and die basically due to the basic accidents. But he says that, however terrible and disgusting the dissolution of the old family within the capitalist system may appear, large-scale industry, by assigning an important part of the socially organized process of production outside the sphere of the domestic economy to women, young persons, and children of both sexes, does nevertheless create a new economic foundation for a higher form of the family, right? So again, this destructive, horrible process could create, And nowadays, in the post 1960s, the so-called, there was a wave of feminism, second wave, I think, where it was all about liberating women by getting them out of the household, right? Getting them into the workforce, right? And that kind of, some cynical Marxist might say you're just liberating women to become wage slaves in the zone of exploitation, right? But there is something liberating about getting out of this sort of like claustrophobic and domineering domestic sphere that is a different form of exploitation. Again, much more personalized form of domination that Marx talks about, like in the feudal eras, where you have someone ruling over you in the household. It's like this patriarchal household that's really domineering, and there is sort of something emancipatory about leaving that sphere. And unfortunately, in this era, they left that sphere to go to these horrible factories, right? But there's something about that creates the conditions for a higher form of the family, where people are free. They're not shackled to this domestic patriarchal exploitation. They're free to do something else under communism, right? All this leads to this. Yeah. So essentially what he's saying is that capitalism, by developing machinery and sort of crushing this domestic economy, and it creates the conditions for what could be seen as like a higher form of family relations under communism. Yeah. And there's all these books out now about abolishing the family, right? And a lot of them use Marx and Engels sort of literature, because they actually said that like the bourgeois patriarchal family is like really horrible and we want to supersede it under communism. But all this stuff in section 9 to me points to this sort of liberatory story about developing technology could be harnessed otherwise. And this tweet I saw when I taught this class in 2020 is really funny. If technology gets really good, necessary labor plummets, and we'll just be able to go fishing and shit on a whim, right? And that's ultimately, I mean, what relative surplus value is harnessing our ability to produce way more stuff in less time, reduces the necessary labor we need to perform to a minimum, and then creating capacities where we could just have leisure and like free to fish and do stuff, right? But what this person is pointing out is that many Marxists today are actually quite anti-technology and anti-machinery, and we've sort of forgotten that Marx is actually living through this pretty revolutionary period of technology. And he says, if you missed it, page 515, footnote 33, he just throws this out there. The field of application for machinery would therefore be entirely different in a communist society than what it is in a bourgeois society. So machinery in itself is pretty horrible under capitalism, but under communism, we could harness it in a liberatory way. Then, he gets into that, there's these long things that Engels sort of inserts some things in there, and then there's a footnote that Engels says, this got to be in the text. So he puts this whole footnote in the text, and it's just this like long exchange between the factory inspectors and over coal mines and these sort of clauses over health and education. One thing that really stuck out to me is though the thing that we're still stuck with today, which is that even when laws are passed, there's just no capacity for these states or governments to actually enforce the laws with actual, people. So in 1865, there were 3,217 coal mines in Great Britain and 12 inspectors. So how are those 12 inspectors going to have any capacity to actually inspect whether these mines are actually safe or healthy for the workers? That's going to be very hard for 12 inspectors. And it reminded me of an example I use in my lectures, which is that a lot of people thought one of the biggest problems with the Deepwater Horizon oil blowout catastrophe oil spill, it had to do with lack of safety, lack of oversight of the safety operations on offshore oil drilling. Almost the exact same numbers were found with regard to this. There are 3,500 production platforms, this time 55 inspectors instead of 12. But the point is that 55 is not very many, and it's hard for those 55 inspectors to be able to really oversee. And by the way, another story was how all these inspectors were kind of in bed literally with the industry. They had like cocaine parties together. It was like this big scandal that the regulators were very much in bed with the industry and so forth. So
it's the same thing with dams as well. It's like
dams.
what state? This came up last year on my classes. that there are like X amount of dams in New York State, and there's only like X amount of inspectors as well. There's lots of dams.
It seems, yeah. And, you know, and we're so thankful that like workers fought to get something like OSHA, like the Occupational Health and Safety. But then you look at like the capacity of OSHA or EPA to actually enforce what's on the books, and it's pretty depressing. And so a lot of things, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Okay, finally, he says, we're going to talk about agriculture later. And he does in volume 3, by the way, but he's like, let's just throw in 2-3 pages on agriculture at the end of this chapter. But this is so crucial, like to Marx's theory, you know, in the sphere of agriculture, large-scale industry has a more revolutionary effect than elsewhere for the reason that it annihilates the old bulwark of the old society. So the peasant gets annihilated by this new form of production. So nowadays, a lot of scholars of agrarian change talk about a process that they call depeasantization, which is really accelerated in the 20th century, particularly over after World War II, all over the world. Countries that had large percentages of the country being peasants are, you know, that peasantry is being destroyed by increasing interconnection with the world economy, right? And then peasants become proletarianized, they become wage workers, right? Thus, the need for the social transformation and the antagonism of the classes reaches the same level in the countryside as attained in the towns. And here again, a conscious technological application of science replaces the previously highly irrational and slothfully, he's mean about peasants sometimes, slothfully traditional ways of working. The capitalist mode of production completes the disintegration of the primitive familial union, which bound agriculture and manufacture together when they were both at an undeveloped and childlike stage. But at the same time, it creates the material conditions for a new and higher synthesis. We've been saying this over and over again. A union of agriculture and industry on the basis of the forms developed during the period of their antagonistic isolation. But capitalist production collects the population together in great centers and causes the urban population to achieve ever greater preponderance. By the way, this has happened in China just in the last like 40 years. The percent of the population that's in urban has just skyrocketed, and the countryside's become depopulated. So this has 2 results. On the one hand, it concentrates the historical motive power of society. On the other, it disturbs the metabolic interaction between humans and the earth. It prevents the return of the soil of its constituent elements consumed by humans in the form of food and clothing. This is kind of what ecological Marxists call the metabolic rift, where humans consume stuff, they create waste that has to go back into the soil. But when all the humans go into the cities, all that waste just gets dumped in the water and doesn't go back to the soil from where the food came from, right? So there's this rift. Hence, it hinders the operation of the internal natural condition of the lasting fertility of the soil. So ecological Marxists quote this section more than any other, where they say, capitalist production therefore only develops the techniques and degrees of combination of the social process of production by simultaneously undermining the original sources of wealth, the soil and the worker. So just in these little 3 pages, you get this little hint of Marx's theory of ecological exploitation, which is that this sort of development of large-scale industry actually rips this population to the towns and creates this kind of destruction of the natural conditions of agriculture, the soil. And so just as much as this chapter is really about the squandering and destruction of human labor power, it's also can be seen as a process that destroys the soil. And unfortunately, it just stops there. And then there's some footnote where he kind of argues with soil chemist named Liebig, and then we're done. And that's the end of part 4. And it's might have been even longer than chapters 1 through 3. So apologies for going on and on. But any questions before we take a break? All right, so Gabe has sent me questions to lead on, which I will do, and I'll do my best Gabe impression, and then we'll go from there. So take a 10 minute, we'll see you at like 3:55. And again, sorry about that.